it's not just that he was scandalous in some of the stuff that he was advocating, everything from the overthrow of the monarchy to free access to contraception, but it's also that you do so at great personal risk.
You're listening to episode 49 of the National Secular Society podcast, produced by Emma Park. The term secularism was coined by George Jacob Holyoake in 1851. By this time, however, Britain's tradition of radicals and freethinkers was already well established, but the major actors of its early years are little known today. In this episode, I will be exploring the origins of secularism in the 18th and 19th centuries. I will be asking why political radicalism was associated with atheism and freethought at this time, and why secularism eventually declined as a political force. This podcast is designed to complement a recent NSS seminar on George Jacob Holyoake, led by Ray Argyle, who has just published a new biography about him. I'm going to be joined by three guests for a virtual roundtable discussion. My first guest, Paul Fitzgerald, is a political cartoonist, activist, and graphic novelist, also known as Polyp. Paul is currently working on a graphic novel retelling the life of Thomas Paine, the 18th century philosopher and revolutionary, who was born in Norfolk in 1737 and emigrated to America just before the War of Independence. Not long after Paine's death in 1809, his controversial book The Age of Reason was republished in England by Richard Carlisle, a journalist and campaigner for press freedom. For this and other offences, Carlisle was sentenced to imprisonment for blasphemy. My second guest, Owen Carter, is writing his PhD on Carlisle and his collaborators, and their interest in science as an agent for social revolution. The work done by radicals like Paine and Carlisle contributed to the emergence of secularism in the mid-19th century as a working-class political force opposed to organised religion. By the turn of the century, secularism in its turn was being sidelined by socialism and the labour movement. My third guest, Matthew Kidd, has just written a book on this topic entitled The Renewal of Radicalism, Politics, Identity and Ideology in England, 1867 to 1924. Owen, Paul and Matthew, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
Hello.
Let's start, first of all, with a little bit of background. Paul, could you take us off by giving us a little potted history of Paine and Thomas Paine? Where did he come from? What were his motivations? Where did he end up?
Sure. I mean, he was somebody who was born basically in a working class family in Norfolk, who really didn't seem to sort of have any intellectual impact until he moved to America. He met Benjamin Franklin in London and moved over to America just at the time that the American War of Independence was kicking off. And that seemed to create an explosion of writing and ideas coming from Paine. His arguments that in fact America should separate from England just galvanized people, even like Washington and Jefferson, who up until then hadn't really felt that was the right route. He seemed to really galvanize them, and this seems to have been his record ever since, with common sense. And obviously particularly relevant to this podcast is the Age of Reason, where he seemed to pull together the first large-scale resistance to, I think, to fundamentalist religion rather than to religion itself. But I think one of the most significant things for me about him is that he's been forgotten. It's absolutely astonishing. This guy who sparked the American War of Independence was one of the first real people to stand up against religious authority. He's just gone from popular history.
Oh, and what about Carlisle? Because he's also someone who's perhaps slightly forgotten. This is really a theme of the investigations which we in the NSS are doing at the moment into the early history of secularism. What was Richard Carlisle's background, and what were his sort of main contributions to the development of radicalism and freethought?
Thanks, Emma. So in common with quite a lot of working class reformers of this period, Carlisle was born into fairly humble circumstances. He was born in Devon in 1790. He was the son of a shoemaker, that kind of infamous radical trade. But the father walked out on the family when Richard was just very young. So he was raised with two sisters by his mother Elizabeth, and had, by the standards of the time, as kind of a good an education as one could really hope for. But by that, we mean a bit of Sunday school and a bit of charity school afterwards. So he got his basic literacy, he got a lot of Bible time and not a lot else. After that, at age 12, he took up the trade of a tinsmith, a very hard itinerant trade, something that was on the way out, but something that was to stay with him for the rest of his life. He was very consciously proud of his working class origins and having raised himself from that. Then later on, he eventually ends up in London in around 1817. And this is kind of at the height of post-war agitation. Finally, all of this energy, which has been restrained after 2 decades of war in the Napoleonic Wars, is suddenly, it's beginning to bubble over. It can't be held back anymore. There's a series of mass meetings being led by Henry Hunt with tens of thousands of people across the country. Carlyle begins to fall into this radical scene. He starts selling radical pamphlets, and then shortly he begins writing and editing a radical journal published by a man called William Sherwin. And then on the back of this, he is invited to attend the mass meeting at St. Peter's Field in Manchester in 1819. And this is the event which will mark really the rest of his life and the fate of radicalism through the remainder of the century, because it is, of course, the site of the Peterloo massacre.
Why is the Peterloo massacre so important for radicalism in the 19th century?
I might jump in there as the chair of the Peterloo Memorial Campaign here in Manchester. It's the turning point in the story of both English and global democracy. And even though it kind of failed in the short term, I think the shock it produced really, really helped push the democracy agenda forward. It happened just down the road from where I'm sat now.
Owen, would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. It's a pivotal moment of trauma and betrayal that really echoes down the century. You have, 50,000 people assembled in their Sunday best, calling peaceably for reform, and they're charged by armed cavalrymen and, slaughtered. There's 18 people dead, hundreds more injured. It's a bloodbath, and it seems to kill off any prospect of peaceful reform for the near future. If a government is willing to do that to crush dissent, what hope is there? It's a very, very dispiriting period, and it will colour absolutely everything in the generations that follow.
Paine and Carlisle, of course, are early radicals in England and then America for Paine and England for Carlisle. But after that, we have the sort of secularists fitting in the mid-19th century, and then we move towards socialism and the rise of the Labour Party in the late 19th century. Matthew, you recently wrote a book on the renewal of radicalism about politics in the late 19th to early 20th century. You started in 1867. Why did you choose that year to begin your book?
The main reason was because this was the year in which the Second Reform Act was passed. This was an act that enfranchised a large portion of the male working class population. And in some constituencies, particularly in some of the mining constituencies, this gave working class men enough clout to send trade unionists to Parliament for the first time, which they did in the general election of the following year. So in that respect, it's an important year and an important moment in British political history. If we think about the later development of the Labour Party, this idea that Labour representation or direct Labour representation by trade unionists in Parliament, this actually happened 30 odd years before, and that was thanks to the Reform Act. I also picked the mid-1860s as a starting point because there was a lot of heightened radical agitation and excitement at this time. Radicals were involved in numerous campaigns and causes at this time, including support for the North in the American Civil War, support for foreign nationalist movements in places like Italy and Poland, trade unionism, and of course, the foundation of the National Secular Society in 1866.
So, Matthew, how would you define radicalism, and where did the National Secular Society and the secularist movement fit into radicalism?
I think if the way that radicalism was used as a term in the 19th century is probably different to how we'd use it today. We tend to use it as a way to describe anything outside the mainstream. And I'm not sure if my fellow speakers would agree with me, but I think in the 19th century, even though the terms left and right weren't used so much in political discourse at the time, radicals at the time would have been seen as on the extreme left, or at least the extreme left of the Liberal Party, or maybe just outside. That's a debate that I engage with in my book. But basically, radicals were anyone who advocated radical reform of the political system. Radical actually comes from the Latin word, I think, radix or radic. My Latin isn't very strong, but which means root. So it's very much this idea that any problem, any political or social problem, we need to strike at the root of it and reform it fundamentally, and a quicker pace than perhaps moderate liberals would argue for.
And the secularist movement?
The secularist movement, I mean, there's again debate about how that fits in. For me, secularism was just one of the many expressions of radicalism at the time. As I said, that there were various different ways in which radicals engaged in the political and social life of the country. And in many respects, they were seen as in advance. They wanted to be in advance of moderate liberalism. And that could mean not just favouring gradual political reform, but actually radical reform. That could mean not just removing some of the powers of the Lords, but abolishing the Lords. And I would argue that the secularism must be seen in the same way, in that this wasn't just about fighting against the established church for nonconformity, but actually going one step further, perhaps, and thinking about the whole idea of religion and its role in public life, but also whether there is a God, for example. And shoemakers were at the forefront of this, as one of my fellow speakers already mentioned.
Owen, would you agree with that in terms of that idea of radicalism as far as it applied to Carlyle and the early radicals and freethinkers?
Yes, I think Matthew's very nicely raised the point that radical, at least in the earlier sense of, root and branch reform, going right to the core of something, this is, the word had been used in that sense from the 17th century onwards, but it's in the 1820s in Britain, specifically in response to dealing with the fallout of Peterloo and the hardening of attitudes, which is following on other sides, which leads to it kind of becoming radicalism with a capital R. And while it would never attain, say, the level of a parliamentary party or really even a parliamentary grouping, we might think of it perhaps as, say, a tendency rather than an ideology. What would probably unite radicals of all stripes, at least in the 1820s, would be a loathing for what they called old corruption. This idea that there's some kind of nexus of aristocratic power which has basically stitched everything up together. So monarchy and the aristocracy and the established religion are all of a parcel and they're all scratching each other's backs. And that if you want to tackle one, you really need to tackle all.
What sort of a radical was Carlyle?
Oh, he was an ultra-radical. He was, there was none more, at least in his own view. He had this paradoxical experience in some ways in which, so trials had actually been, or prosecutions, I should say, had been begun against him earlier on in 1819. He had already drawn the ire of the authorities through reprinting, and among other things, the works of Thomas Paine and the Age of Reason in particular. Then Peterloo happens. It's Carlyle's eyewitness testimony which provides the radical account to that. And then, in reprisal, the government resume those prosecutions with interest, and he's jailed for what will ultimately be 6 years for blasphemy. So what happens then is that, despite being imprisoned, he's able to continue his publishing business. He runs it remotely, directing and submitting copy through the post. And because the authorities are loath to interfere overtly with the sanctity of the postal system, he's able to get away with it despite being banished to rural Dorset. And so what happens then is, paradoxically, he ends up slightly liberated because he's already in prison, but he can kind of publish what he likes. And so he begins to get harder and harder in the stuff that he says. So he shifts from a critique of old corruption to, the journal is called The Republican. The aim is explicit there. He begins to harden his attitudes, moving from, let's say, a kind of free-thinking or deistic tradition to outright atheism and materialism.
And republicanism associated with it.
And republicanism.
Why were the shoemakers particularly radical?
Could I jump in on the shoemakers? I'm sorry to interrupt, but I didn't realise that they were one of the trades that were promoting this kind of radicalism. But one of my favourite scenes in the Thomas Paine graphic novel I'm writing is that the upper classes who, were just totally preoccupied with vilifying Paine, they would quite often go to their shoemakers and insist on having what were called TP nails put in the heels of their shoes, where the nails put into the heel would spell out the letters TP, so that they could spend their days treading on Tom Paine's ideas.
On the question of shoemakers, it's one of the longer standing puzzles in social history. At one point, the legendary historian Eric Hobsbawm actually devoted an entire essay to trying to tackle this question, because it's a phenomenon that plays out not just in Britain, but actually across Europe, is that whoever you are, if you're a shoemaker, you're more likely to be involved in some kind of dissent or discontent. I think the answer that he came up with is that it's a trade that you can conduct quite quietly. The materials aren't overly expensive. It leads itself to having a lot of time for reading and discussing in a small shop, and everyone's got to buy their shoes somewhere, so you're quite well positioned to get the local gossip.
So you can maintain your independence in a way.
Yeah, you can be a small master, but in contact with others as well. So particularly well connected.
Yes, a lot of my research, the book is actually based on some case studies, and it was not a coincidence that most of the places, Leicester, Northampton, that I based the case studies on were centres of the boot and shoe trade. And again, I read that Hobsbawm article, and it was very much a puzzle. I actually came across an article from the 1890s by the shoemaking union trying to answer this question, and they couldn't really answer it. But it was very much, you've got to remember that the mechanization of that industry was quite late compared to some others. So it was the 1890s when they lost a big lockout. That was when the manufacturers started to impose things like discipline that we think today in the workplace. It's hard to believe, but in the early 1890s, shoemakers could come and go in the factories whenever they wanted. They could do as much work on a daily basis as they wanted. It was basically piecework. And there was something very famous called St. Monday, where they'd work so hard during the rest of the week, so they didn't have to go in Monday, so they could go and drink beer. So this kind of autonomy and freedom that they had, even as late as the 1890s, this article from the 1890s suggests that it was that freedom, that sitting around in a factory on your own, there isn't much managerial oversight telling you off for speaking and swearing and talking and discussing. Some people would take newspapers in and read it to the other. There was that kind of introspection, I suppose, that allowed them to become all of them politicians, as one of Northampton's MPs called them.
Well, and Northampton was, of course, the centre for, Northampton was Charles Bradlaugh's constituency. Moving back to Paine, Paul, we've mentioned The Age of Reason, which was, of course, Paine's big book, critique of organised religion and his advocacy of deism. What exactly were his views about organised religion, and how did his experiences in England, America, and France influence them?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that I've found fascinating about Paine. I mean, he kind of has really drawn me in, but being a sort of fairly militant atheist myself, I'm fascinated to see that, as you say, he was a deist. He very much believed in a God. And one of his concerns about the direction that the French Revolution that he was involved with was going was that he felt it was becoming more atheist, which he thought was a very bad thing. I guess the only conclusion I can come to is that Paine was an opponent of religious fundamentalism rather than religion itself. And of course, the churches in America and Europe were all at that time fundamentalist.
They were certainly very much, he criticizes priestcraft, doesn't he? And attacks organized religion, which attempts to impose itself on people.
Sure. I mean, what he seemed most disgusted with was the idea of revelation of these individuals saying, I magically have been given the word of God, and it's not just the word of God, it's the word of God, and everybody else is wrong. And Paine, with this incredibly modern voice in Age of Reason, sort of says, well, why should we believe you? I mean, he's asking these really simple questions that atheists today are still using in debates with the religious people. He sort of said, no, if there is a testimony, if there is a manuscript that God has written, it's very much the universe.
And this is already sufficiently radical to get him in trouble with the authorities.
Yeah, well, I mean, prosecutions. I mean, he'd already had a sentence against him for the rights of man, for his political views. And then Age of Reason not only brought the authorities down on him again, such that he could never go back to England, it also alienated loads and loads of other people who would have considered themselves radicals or progressives, who turned on him. Even the guy who had defended him, Erskine, the famous lawyer who defended Paine for rights of man and done a brilliant job of it, turned against him and prosecuted him, or rather prosecuted this impoverished guy who normally sold religious tracts, but who had sold one copy of Age of Reason.
Owen, on that topic, one of the things that you've mentioned that Carlisle was one of the charges against him that the authorities used to get him imprisoned after Peterloo was that he had republished Paine's Age of Reason. How did Paine's thoughts about religion influence Carlisle?
Utterly, almost to the point of veneration, I would say. So Paine was to be the lodestar by which Carlisle tried to live his life in a lot of ways. He was among the first authors that Carlisle began publishing and republishing the works of, and he would continue that all through the rest of his publishing career. He would cite him explicitly, if you don't know what to do, read Thomas Paine. And yet for all that, Carlisle's own religious views, they meandered around over the course of his career. I think that's one thing we need to say, is that if we're talking about Carlisle and religion, there are many Carlisles. He started off from a position in his adult life of distrust of established religion, which then hardens into deism. Then the experience of imprisonment tilts him into outright atheism. But then after that, he takes another turn again and begins pursuing a quite idiosyncratic personal understanding of allegorical Christianity, by which, depending on what mood he's in, stories about Christ, for example, are actually stories about human reason. The logos is, through a series of historical corruptions, actually proof that there was a pre-Christian worship of reason, for example.
So lots of different ideas floating about there.
Yeah, and then by the end of his career, he was effectively in a church of one, calling himself a Christian, but you'd have been well placed to find anyone who would agree with that sentiment.
So I guess for both Paine and Carlisle, in a way, what distinguished them was they were just prepared to think independently and speak independently from the established orthodoxies.
Very much so, yeah.
Mm. What was Carlisle's significance for the secularist movement in Britain? Owen, perhaps we can start with you on this. I mean, of course, his common law wife, Eliza Sharples, gave lodging to Charles Bradlaugh, the future first president of the NSS, when Bradlaugh was 16. But how did Carlisle's thought and his example influence Bradlaugh and other secularists?
Well, I'd say he was both a cause célèbre and a cautionary tale at the same time. Against the apparent unjustness and tyranny of the extremely restrictive laws that were ushered in after Peterloo, because we mustn't forget those. It's not just a massacre, it's also a stifling environment in which crushes a lot of the life out of dissent. So he is the most strident, most fierce voice and most fierce critic of that regime through the 1820s. For all that, his example is not one that many people are inclined to follow. Because if you're prepared to spend a decade in prison, more power to you. But a lot of people, frankly, aren't. So it's not just that he was scandalous in some of the stuff that he was advocating, everything from the overthrow of the monarchy to free access to contraception, the abolition of marriage as tyrannous to women. But it's also that you do so at great personal risk. So when you have another generation of reformers coming after, for example, George Jacob Holyoake, a great deal has to be done to try and rehabilitate the idea of free thought, to try, if you want to make it politically respectable, whatever personal, private respect you may have for Carlisle's sacrifice, as it were, you do not want to associate with that brand too publicly.
Well, as we learnt from Ray Argyle's book launch the other day at Conway Hall Online, one of the points that emerged was that Holyoake was quite concerned to make secularism and make free thought respectable. Exactly,
yes. And Carlisle had left him with a fine piece of work to do there.
But Matthew, moving on to the sort of mid to late 19th century, the figure of Charles Bradlaugh, I mean, do you think he was in a way more of a successor of Carlisle in his willingness to court controversy?
Yes, basically. It's the Carlisle issue is slightly outside my area of expertise, but just listening to my fellow speaker there, it definitely rung some bells in my mind about Bradlaugh. It sounded very similar to him. There was no coincidence that he often signed off as iconoclast, for example. One of the historians of Bradlaugh called him on the extreme wing of the Liberal Party. And I think that neatly sums up where he was. He was never afraid of controversy. He was involved in 1874, there were riots in Northampton after he lost an election. During the 1860s, he helped to provoke some riots in Hyde Park around the reform agitation. And even though that he, theoretically at least, was a constitutionalist, very much around peaceful action and change through the ballot box, that kind of thing, he had this habit of always being at these kind of places at the wrong time. And his supporters definitely often went beyond the constitutionalist mode of thinking that he advocated. So I think that on those issues, but also on his thoughts on free thought and getting involved in legal cases around the right to free expression and the right to the freedom of the press and that kind of thing, there definitely seems to be a striking similarity between him and Carlyle, I think.
Paul, for Paine, how did radical politics link to his views about religion?
I think it was part of just his thinking that people should be free to have whatever opinion they want. I mean, he did actually, as I say, disapprove of atheism, but I think he very much respected everybody's right to have their own opinion. You know, I mean, that's one of the things he says in the introduction to Age of Reason. So I think it is kind of tied up with his ideas of freedom. But as I say, you know, underneath that is a kind of Paine's suspicion that full atheism is actually going to be destructive to society. He is one of those people who felt that, you know, not in quite such a militant way as his critics, but I think he did feel that a belief in a deity held morality together. It's absolutely fascinating for me to hear this discussion, a sort of triangle between Carlyle, Peterloo, and Paine, because of course, you know, we all know that Carlyle was at Peterloo and was very much involved in the fight against the Six Acts afterwards. But 1819 is the year that a slightly bizarre radical Cobbett dug up Paine's remains in America and brought them over to England, to Manchester, specifically because of Peterloo. He thought that Paine's remains would galvanise a resistance that had been quite suppressed by Peterloo.
And did they have any effect doing that?
Well, no, the remains were stopped on the outskirts of Salford, the sort of twin town of Manchester at the time. And a line of soldiers refused to let them into the city. They were due to go to a dinner, of all things. But yeah, then that's partly how they got lost. Cobbett ended up taking them down south, and they disappeared afterwards.
Owen, for Carlyle, how did his views about religion, well, obviously you said he sort of changed them from time to time, but how did his hostility towards the organised church link to his radical politics?
So I would say for Carlyle, he views it very much as all of a piece. It's a war on all fronts that must be won. And so you're tackling religion, and especially established religion, at the same time that you're tearing down monarchy and the aristocracy, and establishing republics worldwide, ideally. There's a universalism to his republicanism, which is something that he inherits, or certainly feels that he inherits, from Paine.
Matthew, how far did radical politics, say in the mid to late 19th century, how far was it associated with free thought, with atheism, with radical views about religion, as well as politics?
I think the fortunes of the secularist movement ebbed and flowed in line with the radical movement. So there were times when, as I said, in the 1860s, perhaps when the NSS was founded, this was a time of radical agitation on numerous issues, and it's always been an eclectic movement in this time. But something I did want to say when we talk about the link between radical politics and free thinking is that more broadly in this time, religion and politics were intertwined. There wasn't this deep politicization of religion that we have today. It was very much, and I don't want to generalize too much, but if you were a nonconformist, you were probably more likely to vote Liberal. If you're an Anglican, you were more likely to vote Conservative. And if you look at election manifestos from the 19th century, particularly even going up to the late 19th century, there were issues that we today would consider religious issues that maybe have been dealt with, or that aren't the place for politics to discuss. So I think that's always important. And radicals, as the advanced thinkers in politics, would have been seen as the advanced thinkers in religious matters as well. So I think that's quite an important thing to note as well. In terms of how closely linked they were, I think that they were just two of many, if we think of free thought and secularism anyway, they were just two of many of the expressions of radicalism. The link was stronger in certain places than in others. So in Leicester, I would argue it was very, very closely linked. The secularist movement there almost kept alive that post-Chartist enthusiasm for radicalism when, after the defeat of Chartism in the late 1840s, it kind of went underground. It stayed alive in local secular clubs coming together, discussing these kind of issues. It was weaker in other places. Interestingly, secularism was quite weak or the NSS was quite weak in Northampton, which was unusual, even though that was the backbone of Bradlaugh's support. So there wasn't a nice, neat connection, but I think that they definitely moved in parallel with one another.
Having mentioned socialism, we should, of course, also remember that we needn't be talking about Marxist socialism. There is also what Engels would have diagnosed as utopian socialism associated with the philanthropic industrialist Robert Owen, which was, through the 1830s and 40s, a very important force for the later development of secularism. Holyoake, we've mentioned him before, he got his initial training as an Owenite social missionary. So when we're assessing the experience and the developments of later in the century, we've got to remember that there was an integrated political and secular program being pursued there, and which then failed in a number of acrimonious breakdowns of these ideal communities, with Carlyle sniping from the sidelines all the while saying, "I told you so, you didn't listen to me."
But Robert Owen wasn't necessarily an atheist himself, I believe.
No, he wasn't. It's one of those really strong distinctions between the person and the followers. The Owenites certainly had a lot of outright atheists among them.
This has been a really interesting discussion, and we could talk about this all day, but let's just have a couple of final points. Firstly, Paul and then Owen. As far as Paine and Carlisle are concerned, do they still matter today? Are they still relevant to Britain in the 21st century? Paul, what about Paine?
Yeah, I think he is. I mean, I think partly because to some extent he's not an apolitical voice, but he's not a kind of factional voice arguing for reason and common sense. I think that's one of the things that's fascinating about him. But I think also, as kind of Sagan predicted, we are heading into this era now where irrationality seems to be getting a much stronger grip on society again after sort of receding for quite a long time. And of course, I include in that religious fundamentalism. So I think Paine's very, very fresh modern voice is one that we should be rediscovering, as well as just the justice of him not being forgotten, given his impact on history.
Oh, and what about Richard Carlile? What's his legacy? Is he still important today?
Oh, I think in some ways he's more important today than he has been in quite some time. What I mean by that is that quite strikingly, and perhaps in distinction to some of his peers from that kind of era and subsequent generations, he was absolutely forward-focused in his view. It wasn't just about defending old liberties, for example. It wasn't, if you like, a kind of a local radicalism. But as he inherited from Paine, it was universalist in his vision. And also, and I think this is something that really marks him out, he was in love with the promise of science. I think we're in an era now where, whether it's thinking on the global level with regards to the power of the climate crisis, or on a deeply personal level, do we actually possess free will? Can we image the brain and begin to see how human beings actually come to the decisions that they think they make? His kind of idiosyncratic brand of scientifically motivated materialism there would absolutely seize on everything that's under discussion in the problems of our modern world. And in some ways, this is it's almost like a running of the tape beforehand. We've seen what happens. He built an entire ethical system, a program for revolution on the idea that science is going to drive us forward. So, I mean, he would certainly have a lot to say today if he were still alive.
Finally, Matthew, do you think that the relationship between religion and radical politics as such is sort of closer or further apart? We talked about secularism and politics in general, but what about specifically radical politics? Do you think that issues of religion are of greater or less interest to people campaigning for radical change in the 21st century than they were, say, in the mid or late 19th century?
That's a big question. I think that probably less so. I think that, and this is maybe slightly off topic, but I think that the changing nature of socialism within the Labour Party and maybe just outside the Labour Party through the 20th century took religion out of the question. Following on from, we talked about Robert Owen earlier, in the late 19th century, a lot of socialism was a kind of religion in many ways. People like Keir Hardie was very religious. He said that he got all his ideas from Jesus and that kind of thing. You wouldn't hear a leader of the Labour Party say that today.
No. Tony Blair almost did, right?
Very true. It depends which voters they were talking to, I suppose. But yes, so I think that further away, I think that the kind of socialism that fed into the Labour Party, particularly during the 30s onwards, was a kind of, not necessarily Marxian, but definitely more of a kind of materialistic form of socialism, where not necessarily atheism, but secularism was stronger than it had been in the 19th century. And I think that's definitely had an influence, this idea of a separation between politics and religion. Obviously, that's not just the case in the Labour Party. There are other forms of radicalism today, but I think that you're more likely to find devout religious people in other forms, probably non-radical political parties today.
Matthew, Owen and Paul, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This episode was produced by the National Secular Society, all rights reserved. The views expressed by contributors do not necessarily represent those of the NSS. You can access the show notes and subscriber information for this and all our episodes at secularism.org.uk/podcast. For feedback, comments and suggestions, please email podcast@secularism.org.uk. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you can. Thanks for listening, and I hope you can join us next time.